We've already talked about context, the political, social, economic, and religious circumstances that surround an event. Today, we'd like to look at how we get at the context. What are some of the tools that biblical scholars will use? Our goals for today are to define the word exegesis and to describe the purpose of three of these tools: literary criticism, historical, or sometimes called socio-historical criticism, and ideological criticism. The first thing I need to clarify is that criticism is not used in this context the way we normally use it, as if being negative and saying something bad about something. Criticism in this context means to look at a text with a critical eye, in other words, to see it for what it is, as, quote, objectively or unbiasedly as possible. So, for instance, when we look at a Bible text, we don't get caught up in how beautiful the verse is. We try not to say, oh, wow, Jesus is saying something so profound and beautiful. And it can tend to prevent us from seeing what was really meant at the time. So, that gets to our definition of exegesis. Exegesis is uncovering the original meaning of the text. It's trying to ascertain, determine what those words, what a passage, what a story in the Bible was meant to say at that time, not with the overlay of century after century of belief and preaching and a different historical context than what we may have. So let's first start talking about literary criticism. Literary criticism is looking at the type of literature, the type of speech that is being used in a text. And let me give you an example from ordinary life with text messages. When you get a text message, don't you find yourself often asking yourself, wow, is that meant to be a joke? Are they criticizing me? Are they mad at me? Or are they just fooling around? There can be a lot of vagueness. All you see are black letters on a screen or white letters on a screen. Well, literary criticism does the same thing with the Bible. It looks at the words and tries to determine what is the sort of expression, literary expression that's being used. Is it meant to be a story? Is it meant to be a poem? Is it meant to be a joke? Is it meant to be an allegory? So you look at things like literary genre, you try to outline the plot, you examine the character development, you do the sort of things that you might do with a play from Shakespeare or a book from Ernest Hemingway. You do the same thing with the Bible. What is the type of literature? What are the symbols? How do we determine the symbolism? An example from the Bible is you often hear things like Jesus spent 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. Well, you see that sort of expression a lot in the Bible, and you start to wonder, do they really mean 40 days? It would seem coincidental that almost every time in the Bible it's 40 days or sometimes 40 years. Well, we know now from literary criticism that that is just an expression for a long time. So it could have been Jesus was in the desert for 2 weeks, and if you're not eating or drinking, that's a long, long time. I probably didn't spend 2 weeks if he wasn't drinking anything or even eating, probably. The second criticism to look at is historical criticism, or as I said, socio-historical criticism. And this tries to dig back into the text as far as what was going on in the culture. What were the historical circumstances? Again, that part of the context. So, as we talked about in class, we see Jesus always fighting with the Pharisees. And it's been historical criticism that has led us to wonder if the historical Jesus, the Jesus of Nazareth who walked the earth, whether he really had as many conflicts with the Pharisees as the Gospels seem to indicate. Because we know, as we pointed out again in class, that it was during this time that the Pharisees who were the remnant of Judaism were defining Judaism against this branch of Judaism that were Christians. Christians were thinking of themselves still, many of them, as Jews and Christians. And the Pharisees were saying, no, you can't be both. So perhaps when Matthew is writing about the Pharisees, there's a bit of a, well, we don't like what you guys are doing. And it's been historical critics who have looked back in the Bible and said, what was going on in the Jewish world? What was going on in the Roman world in order to evoke these sorts of reactions? The last criticism to look at is ideological. And ideological can be a bit difficult to understand. It really is trying to examine how are scriptures being used by groups to shape public opinion, to build a certain belief system. So this could very often be used, for instance, passages from the Bible have been used to justify slavery. And you look at a Bible passage, often from the Old Testament, but sometimes from the New Testament, and you can say, look, right here, slavery is being approved of. And it's not, ideological criticism tries to look at how we use the Bible to justify our beliefs, and tries to maybe strip that away and say, is it really what the Bible is teaching, or is it really what you believe and you're using the Bible in order to justify what you already believe? So again, all of these criticisms are tools of exegetes who are trying to uncover, trying to get at the original sense of the Bible and strip away some of our accretions, things that have built up over the centuries that can blur what perhaps St. Paul meant in his letters, what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John intended to say in their Gospels. So very often, literary criticism is referred to as the world of the text. Historical criticism is the world behind the text. And ideological criticism is the world in front of the text, before you even get to what's on the page. It's the prejudices, the biases, the belief systems you bring to it.